Hi guys, my name is Chris, and I wanted to talk about the making of Linux. I thought this was kind of a really interesting story when I heard it, and I wanted to tell it again. Thought maybe it fit under the why choose Linux or the interesting facts about Linux. So I wanted to say, thank you to this Saren Yurbarak. I'm sure I'm not saying that correctly. For her podcast, Command Line Heroes, it's excellent podcast. If you haven't listened to it, definitely check it out. A lot of this came from the first two episodes, where she was talking about the history of operating systems and the history of kind of Linux and how that began. She works for Red Hat. Okay, so 1980. It's just before Linux. Linux came out in 1991. So in 1980, we had these two big giants, especially in kind of the desktop PC world. You had Microsoft. And Bill Gates kind of had that at the time, and Apple was Steve Jobs at the time. So in the very beginning, this whole kind of graphic user interface started with Xerox. And Xerox had this really cool kind of graphic user interface, and they had folders, and they were not smart with it. They wanted to show it to Steve Jobs, hoping Steve Jobs is going to do business with them. And Steve sees it, leaves, and steals it. And he goes back to Apple and says, "Do this. I want this. Let's make this a computer." And they started creating graphic user interface. And the whole time they're doing that, the whole time they're working on the first Macintosh, they go over to Microsoft, to Bill Gates, and they get his advice or Microsoft's advice. And they're asking, "What do you think of this?" And then Microsoft gives them feedback. And they say, "Oh, what do you think of this?" And Microsoft gives them feedback. And then Apple, after a while, was kind of realizing Microsoft was asking questions it didn't need to know the answer to. Kind of questions as a little too invasive. And they started getting suspicious. They told Steve Jobs that, "Nah, he's not going to do anything. Don't worry about it." And then, lo and behold, they steal the graphic user interface from Apple, and they develop their own computer, the Windows 1.0. Of course, Steve Jobs freaks out, and Bill Gates says, "You stole it too. You did it first." So I wanted to play this. This is from 1983. I hadn't seen this before. This was the Super Bowl ad from Apple. We'll just play this first. This is kind of the idea of what Steve Jobs, or pretty much Steve Jobs, thought Apple was at the time, thought this Macintosh was.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. For the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each work may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory thoughts. But of course, is more powerful than any creed or on the other. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will rally them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Yeah. So that's what Steve Jobs saw Apple as being, kind of breaking the mold, and stepping outside of the box with this wonderful idea of the graphic user interface, which is kind of funny considering how it's today become a box. You can't break outside of it. You have to take it or leave it. It's, all of their products usually are. So we had two giants. We have Microsoft and Apple, and 1991. Just before Linux, we have Unix and Unix, kind of we're looking at it's basically very, very similar. But it was used by scientists. It was used by academia. This was very expensive, or businesses as well. It's very expensive. You could develop your own tools for it, but they were extremely litigious. They didn't want it to get away from them. They would sue people over anything if you took it and used it in a way they didn't want or didn't you weren't licensed to. They would sue you. And it cost $5,000 in 1990. It wasn't cheap. And they had this idea of being mentally contaminated. That if you ever saw their code, which anyone that worked with Linux, anyone that's ever worked at a business that's used Linux, and you were writing any code in there, if you've seen any of their code, you could never contribute to any OS in the future, or they would sue you, saying that you were mentally contaminated. You have their ideas in your head, and you can no longer be unbiased when writing code. Kind of this ridiculous idea. Um, Also, at that time, we had GNU. So GNU is not Unix, which was a free to use and share, very similar to Unix, but no Unix code. This was developed by Richard Stallman. And he was looking towards an open source world. He wanted people to be able to contribute, to be able to create their own products, where it wasn't, this bar of $5,000 you had to pay in order to develop any sort of code, any sort of product. So anyone, 16-year-old kid in their basement could write code and could develop and could contribute to this or could use this. Um, and then one of the bigger parts, more very important part, is that you developed this license for it, which protected itself from Unix, from lawsuits, and also required that any sort of thing that was developed under this license is free and open source. And then comes Linux. In 1991, the fall of 1991, it came out. 1991, 1990, Linus Torvalds wanted to upgrade his PC. He wanted to put, I believe, a new processor into his PC, and it wasn't compatible with the operating system. It didn't have the firmware, it didn't have the drivers in order to run it. And so, but he wanted to run it. He wanted to use it, and he he wanted to find a solution. He was programming half of his life, and he decided to go ahead and make Linux. He'd never worked with Unix before. He looked at Unix and said, "Oh, it's way too expensive. I can't afford this." But he'd never looked at it before, so he could do this. He could create Linux. And he went out and found a lot of programmers that were his buddies, that were his friends, that were maybe would help him with a few lines of code here, a few lines there. And in the fall of 1991, he releases 10,000 lines of code, and that was the beginning. 10,000 lines of code, which at the time was huge. It was crazy. It was kind of revolutionary because it was free and it was open source, and people were kind of excited about it and contributing towards it. Now, 10,000 lines of code, it's like, yeah, okay, what else? But this was kind of the beginning, and it was very different than what Apple was doing, that what Macintosh was doing, or Unix, what they were doing. They're trying to lock it down, like don't touch it. If you touch it, we'll sue you, or if it gets out, you can't use it. We have to do everything. You can't add to it. And they're saying, no, go ahead, add to it. Help. We need help with this. Talk to us. How can we improve it? More user control. And it started to grow really fast. In 1991, it was released. Up until 2000s, kind of just exploded. The contributors just grew. So more and more and more and more contributors. Linus would start, and he would delegate some responsibilities of the kernel and other aspects to people that he trusted, and those people would find five other people they trusted, and those people would find other people they trusted, and there would be, they would kind of sort through the people contributions coming in and everything, and work its way up until you get to the top of Linus and you finish a product. Unfortunately, it takes a long time. We'll talk about that later. But it just kind of grew, and everyone wanted to you know chip into it. Someone would write a piece of code, and like, oh hey, what do you think of this? I did this for my project or whatever. And people were at the beginning not taking it seriously, but in 2001, IBM, big company at the time, obviously invested $1 billion into Linux, and that's when it was kind of, other companies at the time, they invested as well, like Oracle, but IBM investing $1 billion lion's share, and that really said that Linux is a serious operating system. We have to take this seriously. And then they have the mascot, which is a little less serious, but this was developed at that time too. And it was the story was that Linus had gotten bitten by a penguin at the zoo, and he told the story on his blog. At the same time, they were looking for a mascot, and I ended up with this little guy, who I love. He's great. So when Linux was released, a lot of people were really afraid, and they had these kind of fraud campaigns, this fear, uncertainty, doubt, where they were trying to undermine Linux. Steve Ballmer was one of those people. He was the CEO of Microsoft, who was saying things like Linux is a cancer and it's terrible. At the same time, where you're saying this, which I thought was kind of funny. If you haven't seen that video, you should check it out. It's only like 30 seconds, but I don't have time. But okay, so after that, Microsoft did this huge 180, and it started putting Linux in its cloud. When it released the cloud interface, it had Linux operating system freely available there for anyone. They even went so far as to put a giant billboard behind their CEO saying Microsoft hearts Linux. So Linux, since its beginning, has really been going in a lot of different directions, which I thought was kind of cool. We have Ubuntu, which I use, which is kind of developed for maybe a PC user, a great graphic interface, and it's pretty, a lot of tools in it, and they have a lot of different others. You check them out, like Red Hat, Fedora. If you're thinking about switching to Linux, look at all of the options and find what's kind of right for you. Linux took over smartphones pretty early. It beat out Microsoft when Microsoft was trying to get into it, and who has a Microsoft phone now? No, it's Android and iPhone, um, and all of the Android in 2014. Google's Linux-based Android, 75% of the smartphones. It just demolished the market. It just took over everything. If you're interested, Oracle was suing Google for its use of Java code in their Android phones. I think just recently, it's kind of overturned, and Oracle kind of won. I think it's something like $8.6 billion, if I remember correctly. If you're interested in that, you should check it out. But Linux is everywhere. It's something I find really cool. Like you can put it in anything. You can take it and put it in the robot that you made, the Lego robot or something. You can do whatever you want with it. It's in POS systems, point of sale software. It's in supercomputers, in-flight entertainment system, Internet of Things devices. It's supposed to be a small servers and smartphones. It's all over the place. And it's still open source. It's been 27 years since the beginning of Linux. And thanks to that license, it's not going to change. It will always be there for you to use it, to add to it. Um, it's never going to go away. And it broke up this kind of monopoly where computers were becoming boxes that you can't change. Now you can do whatever you want with your hardware. So there are some problems with Linux. It takes usually a much longer time to fix bugs, generally about 3 years to work its way up the chain into the kernel. Um, Also, sometimes you have to run applications like Wine in order to run some games that are only built for Windows and Macintosh PCs.